So, a few introductory comments to this lecture. It's hard to imagine the degree to which Freud reintroduced biological or introduced biological ideas into the study of the human psyche, because by the time Freud came along, most of the formal thought and about the human psychology was very influenced by Enlightenment ideas. And so there was a relatively widespread belief that people were rational and scientific and becoming increasingly more so. And perhaps people were becoming increasingly more so. But Freud put the biology back in psychology. I mean, he was a medical doctor and he was trained as a neurologist. And he was also part of a burgeoning interest in placing human beings firmly in the category of the animal kingdom that was characteristic of the late 1900s, particularly in relationship to Darwin. It was Freud who most particularly established the fact that our rationality is in some sense nested inside our motivations and emotions and our unconscious mind. And I think there's no doubt that those claims are correct. Psychologists have always had an animus towards Freud. It's not exactly clear why. He was a psychiatrist, he was a medical doctor, so maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's the distinction between the different professions. But I also have this proclivity to believe that psychologists tend more towards the type of person who's convinced that the primary activities that characterize the human psyche are rational, cognitive, and we certainly have Freud to thank in large part for making a strong case that that's not true. You'll encounter lots of psychologists who do their best in some sense to push Freud to one side and consider his theories outdated and unproven. And, you know, I don't really think that's fair. Partly because the literature regarding psychoanalysis as an effective treatment seems to indicate quite clearly that it's at least as or more effective than other psychotherapeutic schools. And it's basically showed that since outcome studies of psychotherapy have been conducted. So that's 3 or 4 decades.
Is it the same for men and for women, those studies?
I don't know if there are gender differences. I've actually never looked into that with regards to outcome studies. I don't think they're substantive. So, because I've never heard much made of them. Now, the other issues that Freud described, for example, that much of our psychological life is unconscious, and much of it is motivated by what are both implicit memories, so memories we don't really realize that we have anymore, or basic biological drives, that seems to me to be unquestioned. 30 years ago, a little more than that, psychologists rediscovered the unconscious, and they made a big fuss about that, but I was well versed in psychoanalytic thinking by that time, and certainly didn't regard that as particularly revolutionary, because as far as I could tell, the psychoanalysts had been there 60 years before. In fact, a lot of the experimental procedures that psychologists use to examine the unconscious are derived from the sorts of word association studies, priming studies in some sense, that Carl Jung pioneered when he was still working with Freud. So, we have a lot to thank Freud for. I mean, he also introduced and developed the idea of psychotherapy as something distinct from medical treatment for mental disorders. And you know, I think there is room for a variety of opinions about the overall social and cultural utility of psychotherapy. I've read interesting critiques making the claim that it's reduced the necessity for familial and friendship ties, for example, as it's proliferated through society. But be that as it may, all of the psychotherapeutic fields that are practically applied, I think, have Freud to thank for their founding. So it seems a bit on the ungrateful side to criticize him too harshly. I've also found that Freud's conceptualizations of certain pathways to psychological pathology are fundamentally correct, and I'll discuss those in a little bit more detail as we proceed through today's lecture.